Hello, my name is Paradox, and I'm kind of a lore guy for Path to Nowhere, and so I'm here to just make a quick and obviously very scuffed guide for the ideal way of going through Path to Nowhere story. And so I'll be going through the main story, Eternal Nightmare, event stories, and a tiny touch up on interrogations, because the most interrogations do not have a major spoiler thing for the main story, with the exception of any interrogation that was released post chapter 13, because they might have some slight allusions to stuff that goes down in the Rustfire arc, which is chapter 9 through chapter 13. So, basically, you can see later down in the video what events were released in what order, and from there you can get what sinners were released with those events, and then from that you'll be able to derive whose interrogation to not do until you've gone through at least chapter 12. And so anyway, for starters, you just want to go through chapter 1 through chapter 8, just as a basic that, because those were the released chapters for the most part. Chapter 7 and chapter 8 I think were released about a week or so later, but by this point no events have gotten released, and so you just want to kind of go through that first. Go through chapter 1 through chapter 8, and then once you finish chapter 8 is when we get into the timeline of when the events start happening, and also when they got released, which, by the way, little fun fact and also a helpful little guide, is that Path to Nowhere actually, for the most part, with literally only 4 exceptions, releases events, including Eternal Nightmare, in chronological order. Basically, if it's released then, and it's also kind of tied to real life, closer to when the CN chapters get released, or and events get released. But basically, it's within the month. If a month passes by in the real world, and then an event is released, most likely that event takes place a month after whatever was released a month ago. So yeah, basically, IRL time passage actually applies to Path to Nowhere for the most part. And so, after chapter 8, we get down to Raging Sands and Dreamy Bubble. Again, they happen in this order. This Raging Sand happens in September of NF12, 112, and Dreamy Bubble happens in late September to early October of, again, NF12. I'm not going to be using the year system for this one because it's already as scuffed a guide as it is right now, and I just want to get this out before Rainburst and Unfurl get their reruns, because those are very important to know when to do them, which is, just saying this now, do not do those event stories until you have completed chapter 11 and 12. 11 more so than 12, but still, because a major plot point happens in those two that gets massively spoiled, I think almost immediately in Unfurl, and also within the context of Rainburst. Okay, so back to where I was. You want to do chapter 1 through 8, and then that's when you get to Raging Sands and Dreamy Bubble, which are right now available through the permanent event system thing that Antio just put out, and they're currently the only events available through that. And then you want to do Night of Wonder, which hasn't rerun still, so you might want to just see that story on YouTube if you really want to. They're very easy to access through YouTube, just the story alone. Beyond Discourse was rerun earlier this year, and so again, if you want to experience that story, you might want to just search it up on YouTube. Dragon of Isle, again, another event which hasn't gotten a rerun. And then that is the end of the pre-chapter 9 but post-chapter 8 events. And so, from then on, we get to chapter 9 through 13, but more for this part specifically, chapter 9 through 12 is the more important block for right now, because that is when, like, it's after chapter 12 that we get Adela's event, Cabernet's event, Rainburst, Floral Unfurl, Levin, and Eve's events. Now, it is important to note that Adela's event, Cabernet's event, Levin's event, and Eve's event are the only 4 events which happen out of sync of the chronology. So they are not released within the chronological schedule that most events are. Rainburst and Floral Unfurl are still follow this schedule, and that's why they're extremely major spoilers. So you can do these 4 events without getting spoiled on chapter 12 and 11 necessarily. But yeah. However, Rainburst and Floral Unfurl will absolutely spoil you on what goes down in chapter 11 and 12, which is a pretty major plot point. And so, with their rerun coming up, if you just go through the stages and immediately skip the story, it will save the story bits at the same time that you skip them, in the archives. So you can just skip them, finish those events, have the story saved onto your archive, while also getting through the stages, and you'll be good and have them saved, and you can just replay them whenever you finish chapter 12. And if you're really impatient until you finish chapter 11, but preferably you finish chapter 12 alongside those, because chapter 12 is also a short chapter. And so, from then, after Eve's event, is when chapter 13 got released, and with that is the most recent chapter. And now, it is important to note, between chapter 12 and chapter 13, we got the first 2 Eternal Nightmare stories, which you can find through here. The first Eternal Nightmare story, Illusionary Moon Rising, will be available for everybody. It's automatically unlocked, the whole 100% of it, for everybody, because the route for it was a limited time thing when they were testing it out, testing out Eternal Nightmare system. Hunting Shade, it was also released like this, but you have to go through its route. You have to do Eternal Nightmare. And I'd recommend, before you do any story for Eternal Nightmare, you go through, the first Eternal Nightmare story, because it's important context. But again, after chapter 11 and 12, because just like Rainburst, it happens chronologically. This got released between chapter 12 and 13, same with Hunting Shade. And so they have some spoilers for what goes down in chapter 11 and 12. And if you really want to get into the nitty-gritty details, it's chronologically, chapter 12 happens, then Illusionary Moon happens, then it's Rainburst, and then Floral Unfurl, yeah, it's a bit of a tongue twister. And then after that is Hunting Shade. And after that point is when chapter 13 got released. And after chapter 13 got released is when we have, Quixotic Troop, all the way up to the most recent event of Into the Blue. That's when we get all those events. And it's going to include the upcoming anniversary event after the rerun of Rainburst and Flora Unfurl. And so that's a pretty good guy. Yeah. And then for a little bit of further details, again, going back to being in chronological order, is that chapter 13 gets released. It's Quixotic Troop, and then Heart of Eternity that's when it happens chronologically in January of NF14, 114. So yeah. And then right before LL's event, Into the Deep Blue, is when Embers of Long Night happens. Again, going if you want to know the chronology. And there's actually a little bit of a tiny spoiler in LL's event for something that gets revealed at the end of Empress of Long Night, but it's you have to go through a certain dialogue option and also know what the F you're looking at for it to be a spoiler, but it's still, if you want to be aware of that. And again, these are just like the event stories. You can go through like all the routes in the Eternal Nightmare like main mode and just skip the story, and it will be saved right here. So you can just go through each route, collecting the stories, and then go and finish chapter 12 and chapter 13 respectively for the each of the two parts. Each 4 parts, split into 2 bits. But yeah. And also, I would like really ideally like point out that you really want to do these in order of like once you get to them of Illusionary Moonrising, Hunting Shade, and then chapter 13, and then Eternal Nightmare, Heart of Eternity, and then Embers of Long Night. Like, you really want to do those in like order due to the fact that there is an overarching story that they tell of both DC and Chief. Like, there is like actual very visible character development between those two, like happening as those progress further and further, and it's really escalating. Like, and you don't get that feeling of escalation if you do them out of order. Okay, and as for interrogations, I'm only gonna lightly touch up on them because for the most part, it's like, oh, the event happens, and then after that, the interrogation happens, and they're supposed to be like, for the S rank centers that like the event focus on, their interrogations are supposed to be like a final little wrap up to what happens in their event. And sort of same thing goes for like Hamill. However, her event is locked until you finish chapter 8, so it's like no reason to give you a spoiler for that because you physically can't do that until you finish chapter 8. And so the only like interrogations that you really need a spoiler for are the fact that Shalom's, Kokaliks, Ravens, Rahu, and what is it? Let me see. Oaks, Eves, and Donalds. Those are going to give you like big spoilers for chapters 11 and 12 and chapter 13 respectively. Shalom's, Kokaliks, Rahu's interrogations can all be safely like done with no spoilers after chapter 12. Like, it's even recommended that you do Shalom's interrogation after completing Rainburst, and of course, like with that, Rainburst and Flora Unfurl, and with that implies, completing chapter 12 because of the spoilers that those two events contain within them. You do Shalom's interrogation because 1, it's like the best interrogation out right now, and 2, incredibly lore heavy, and thus also incredibly spoiler heavy. You cannot get through this interrogation without getting a bunch of spoilers. And same semi goes for like Kokaliks and Rahu's, but like to a slightly lesser extent. Ravens and Oaks and Donald's interrogations will spoil you on what goes down on chapter 13. And the funny little outlier here is Eve's the 4th stage of Eve's interrogation will actually give you a flat-out spoiler to what happens in chapter 11 that is a major plot point and a major spoiler. Obviously, I'm not going to say what it is because that would defeat the whole purpose of giving the warning. But yeah, so just don't do Eve's interrogation at all if you get her, because again, it will spoil you for what goes down in chapter 11 and 12 at the very end. And so, no point in starting the interrogation if you can't finish it. But it's sorry, excuse me for that. Yeah. Some people are gonna judge me for not having finished Donald's interrogation yet, but so be it. Yeah. And again, basically, all interrogations are linked to their respective event for any sinner who is released after launch. And if you want to know who was a launch sinner, you can just go to Sins, which is a great guide site, to see who was a launch sinner. And yeah. And so that will be basically it for what I have to say in this extremely scuffed guide. I might make a better scripted version of this guide later, But I just really felt the need to put this out before, you know, Rainburst and Flora Unfurl get their reruns, so people know that, hey, one, it's perfectly reasonable to just skip the story and do the stages so you can have it into your own archive collection. You can revisit it whenever you want. Because, again, massive spoilers for chapter 11 and 12 in those events. Okay? And so, yeah. This has been Dr. Pounder Dogs, and see you later.